The moment the police officer stepped out of his cruiser, I could already see the confusion on his face. My wife stood calmly beside our mailbox, holding the bright yellow HOA violation notice like it was nothing more than junk mail. Meanwhile, across the street, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, stood with her arms crossed and a smug smile that said she believed she had just won some kind of battle. But what happened next would leave everyone on that quiet suburban street completely speechless. Because within the next few minutes, the officer would look from my wife to our house, back to her again, and say something that made Karen's smile disappear instantly. "Wait, Judge? You live here?" If you've ever dealt with an HOA before, you know they can be intense. Our neighborhood HOA prided itself on maintaining standards. That meant rules for everything: grass height, mailbox paint color, the exact type of flowers allowed in front yards, even the angle your trash cans had to face. Most neighbors followed the rules just to avoid trouble, but Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she lived for them. She acted like she had personally been appointed the guardian of suburban civilization. The whole situation started over something unbelievably small. My wife had parked our pickup truck in the driveway instead of the garage. Not permanently, just overnight after we had finished unloading groceries in some heavy boxes. Apparently that violated HOA code section something or other. The next morning, a fine notice appeared taped to our door demanding we pay $200 within 5 days. My wife read the letter, laughed quietly, and placed it on the kitchen counter like it was nothing. "I'm not paying that," she said. "It's ridiculous." And honestly, I agreed. But Karen must have been watching the house like a hawk, because by the afternoon, she marched across the street and knocked on our door. When I opened it, Karen stood there holding a clipboard like she was conducting a military inspection. She informed me very dramatically that we were in violation and needed to comply immediately. I tried to stay polite and explain the truck had only been there temporarily, but Karen wasn't interested in explanations. She kept repeating the phrase "community standards" like it was some sacred law. Finally, my wife stepped forward and calmly said, "We're not paying the fine." Karen blinked twice like she had just heard something illegal. "Then I'll escalate this," she said sharply before stomping away. 2 days later, the escalation arrived in the form of flashing red and blue lights outside our house. I looked out the window and saw a police cruiser parked by the curb while Karen stood on the sidewalk, pointing dramatically toward our driveway. My wife walked outside before I could even ask what was happening. The officer approached her with the cautious tone of someone who clearly wasn't sure why he'd been called. Karen jumped in immediately, explaining that we were in violation and violating community regulations. The officer looked puzzled, but asked my wife if everything was okay. My wife held up the violation notice and calmly explained the situation. She told him Karen had called the police because she refused to pay an HOA fine over a truck being in our driveway overnight. The officer looked at the paper, then at Karen, then back at my wife like he was trying to solve a puzzle that made absolutely no sense. Karen kept insisting that rules are rules and demanded the officer force us to comply. That's when the officer asked my wife for her name so he could log the call. The moment she said it, everything changed. The officer froze. His posture stiffened and his eyes widened slightly. He looked down at the name again on the paper, then back at her face like he was making sure he heard correctly. "Wait, hold on. Judge?" Karen suddenly looked confused. The officer stood a little straighter and spoke again. "Judge Malik? As in County Circuit Court?" My wife gave a small, polite nod. The officer's entire demeanor shifted instantly. His tone went from casual to extremely respectful in less than a second. Karen's confident expression collapsed like a house of cards. The officer cleared his throat and turned slightly toward Karen. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "this is a civil HOA matter, not a police issue." Karen tried to interrupt, saying rules had been broken and enforcement was required, but the officer simply shook his head. Calling the police over an HOA parking complaint is not appropriate. Meanwhile, my wife remained completely calm the entire time, which somehow made the situation even more awkward for Karen. Karen looked like she was struggling to process what was happening. Just minutes earlier, she had expected the police to force us into paying a fine. Instead, the officer was now politely apologizing for the inconvenience and assuring my wife that the call would simply be logged as a misunderstanding. Before leaving, he gave Karen a very direct piece of advice. HOA disputes should be handled through HOA channels, not emergency services. Karen stood there stunned while the police cruiser pulled away. For the first time since we moved into that neighborhood, Karen didn't say a single word. She quietly turned around and walked back to her house while several neighbors who had been watching from their windows slowly disappeared inside again. The yellow violation notice never appeared on our door after that day. And here's the funny part. My wife never once mentioned her job during the entire argument. She never raised her voice, never threatened anyone, never tried to pull rank. She simply refused to pay a ridiculous fine and let the situation unfold naturally. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply staying calm and letting the truth reveal itself. But it does make you wonder, if Karen had known who she was dealing with from the start, would she have still called the police over a parked truck? And if you've ever had a crazy HOA story of your own, you're definitely not alone, because neighborhoods everywhere seem to have at least one Karen who believes she runs the entire street.